Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you're connecting from. I'm Ira Feldman. I'm the MEPTEC Executive Director, and I'd like to welcome you to today's MEPTEC IMAPS Semiconductor Industry Speaker Series. We hold a speaker series multiple times a month, and we are working on confirming additional presenters this month and next month, and we will announce them as soon as they are confirmed. The webinars typically start at 11:30 a.m. Pacific and run approximately an hour. If you are interested in speaking at a future webinar, please reach out to me and let me know your interest. We are happy to entertain a wide range of topics. And an upcoming event we'd like everybody to save the date for is November 9th and 10th, which is the next episode in the MEPTEC Road to Chiplets Data and Test webinar. It'll be held over multiple days. We're looking at the importance of data and test to enabling chiplet-based devices. In terms of MEPTEC, we are a membership-supported organization. So we have both individual memberships and corporate sponsorships. If you haven't joined or renewed, please do so at meptec.org. If your company is interested in sponsoring, please let us know. If you have any questions, please reach out to Betty Cooper, and she'd be happy to give you all the details. So thank you for your support, which enables webinars like this to be held free and open to everyone. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Rothrock from ATREG, who's going to talk about the global OSAT market, the new normal. Stephen founded ATREG in 2000 to help divest and acquire infrastructure manufacturing assets and R&D facilities. Over the last 20 years, his firm has been involved with a significant majority of transactions wafer fab sales in the semiconductor space. Prior to founding ATREG, he established Collier International's Global Corporate Services Division based in Seattle. And before that, he worked in commercial real estate brokerage in London. So with that, it is my great pleasure to turn things over to Stephen.
Thanks very much, Ira. Appreciate the opportunity to be back with you and be in front of your audience here today. You've invited us to talk about the global semiconductor market and really what's happening with manufacturing assets. And so the title of the talk today is The New Normal. And turning to the next slide, as we look at the agenda, the goal here is let you meet ATREG, talk about the drastic changes that have really happened over this last year, what's happening with some of the global fab assets, and also what's happening within the global OSAT market. And I think importantly, we're in a new era here where global incentives have returned to the table in pretty much every market throughout the world. So we're going to talk about a few of those, and then finally look at key takeaways and finish up with questions and answers. So moving to our third slide, and to give you a little overview on ATREG, Ira mentioned a little bit, we've been in existence for over 22 years. We've got office in Seattle, another one in the Bay Area, and another one over in Tokyo. I think importantly for the company, we assisted in the sale of over 100 infrastructure-rich clean room facilities around the world. Some of those have been shells, some of those have been, cold, other ones warm. But importantly, on the operational semiconductor side, or for operational fabs, both front end and back end, we've participated and put together over 60 transactions on that front. Our sales have been close to $6 billion. And the typical time it takes us to sell one of those facilities, if we can get involved with a company early, is about a year versus companies doing them themselves that can take over 2.5 years. So let's look at a couple of those on our fourth slide here. Just a few of the transactions that have taken place in what has been a really already busy 2021. Texas Instruments, who've been a longstanding client of ours for over 15 years, we assisted them on the acquisition side to acquire the former Micron fab in Lehi, Utah. This was a joint venture that Micron had with Intel. And we brought that to TI a year ago and entered into discussions, and it's enabled them to take on a new facility that will provide them with a new 1,200 member workforce. It provides them with immediate supply of clean room space in a market, that is currently desperate for supply. And it happens to be in fairly close proximity to their main Dallas headquarters. So a real win-win for everybody with respect to this transaction. The Allegro transaction is one that took place in Thailand. They built this facility less than 5 years ago, a substantial, almost 400,000 square foot facility for advanced packaging. We sold that facility here. It just closed actually in July to InnoLight. The pre-facility, that it's a brand new greenfield that was taken a year ago in September. An important transaction, certainly in the US, because number one, it'll be one of the first ever silicon carbide 200 millimeter facilities, and they decided to build it brand new. That deal was really also precipitated by the fact that there was a tool line in New York that enabled them to get their process qualified on 8-inch while that fab has been going up. It just got closed in June, and tools are now being installed into that facility. Also, a 300 millimeter fab that we helped on purchase, former IBM facility that went to Global Foundries in East Fishkill, which has now become ON's biggest facility in the world. And a couple of other transactions there. Another one for TI over in Scotland, and one where we assisted Vanguard in purchasing a 200 millimeter fab in Singapore. And moving on from that, let's look at where things are at in terms of our year of change within the market. We've got a new administration here within the United States who are putting semiconductor at the top of their agenda. It's being driven by what's happening within the geopolitics between the US and China. We're in an industry here which is hitting 500 billion in terms of overall revenue. We haven't seen such a massive market upturn in the industry really since 2003. And I think what's important with regard to the new administration in the US, which is having a knock-on effect with administrations in Europe, in Korea, and Japan, is that there's an awareness that the semiconductor facilities have been moving offshore for a number of companies over the last 20 to 30 years due to environmental issues, due to issues of wage and labor rates, and really due to the rise of the foundry era within semi. There's this last year with regard to the market, we've seen an unprecedented rise in prices driven by a variety of factors, from our virtual work to the need for more remote infrastructure, a rise in the automotive market, and in many other markets with respect to our portables, our infotainment, and everything else. We've also seen a precarious dependency on Taiwan that has developed over this last year. The capacity of the world's leading foundry, TSMC, is maxed out. Companies are feeling this. Small and medium-sized companies are being put on allocation for higher volume customers. And the result is that many companies and many countries are relying on Taiwanese foundries. Their relationship with China is a concern. It's complex. And some of these companies are feeling a need for more US and European and other country-specific manufacturing. So the supply shortage, in these key industries, is really spurring this, and it's resulting in the building of new fabs around the world. Well, I'll go into that in a little later slide, talking to you about some of these greenfields. Typically, it takes 3 years to really take a site from being shovel ready to having a fab up and running at any volume with tools qualified. We're also seeing a huge demand with respect to 200 millimeter fabs. Foundry limitations have been felt by everyone, but particularly by smaller companies. It's been more of a drive for internal manufacturing control with multiple fabs on the market. We've been seeing unprecedented demand and rises in prices for these facilities, approaching 35% over what we were seeing a year ago. I think for the European Union too, there's been a wake-up call, and they've been looking at new incentives, which we'll touch on in here. And I guess finally, it's to say there's been an increased disengagement from China, and we anticipate that a continuing exodus with respect to some of the manufacturing will continue to happen over this next year as it relates to China. So let's go on to our sixth slide here. Back in 2013, ATREG put out a white paper talking about the inflection point, and we really predicted a rise in semiconductor production costs in that paper. We talked about the macro forces and emerging trends that are reshaping the industry. That paper is still available on our website if anybody is interested. But today's leading fabs now are costing upwards of $20 billion to reach the scale they need to really compete. And companies are planning, in some instances for investments that approach $100 billion. Intel, for example, looking at greenfield options in Germany, in the United States, in different, states from New York to Arizona. Also looking at expanding their foundry services business, expanding some of their existing fabs from New Mexico to Kiryat in Israel. And with more incentives coming into the market, I think we're going to see more of this with some other companies as well. So let's look at the global fab assets that we outline here in starting on slide number 8. ATREG tracks all of the clean room front end and back end facilities around the world. We've been doing so since 1998. It helps us to follow some of those mega trends and see things that are unfolding. I think some just quick things of interest to note. 50% of all new fab projects since 2019 have been 300 millimeter fabs. For a long time, there were 100 300 millimeter fabs. Today, we have upwards of 135, and it's moving towards 150 300 millimeter fabs around the world. In terms of 200 millimeter fabs, they've been fairly steady at about 250, and there are some additions like the Cree facility that's just being finished in New York, like the new 200 millimeter facility that TSMC is building. In terms of 150 millimeter fabs, if they don't have conversion kits that can take them to 200 millimeter, those fabs are really in decline. We are seeing third generation products for MEMS and other specialty products coming into 150 millimeter fabs, and we expect that will increase as MEMS and the sensor sector is looking at a 25% increase in shipments. Power devices, for foundries are forecast to jump, 23%. And we're seeing this across the board for a lot of other products.
Stephen, so you're talking about a lot of processes that require or typically are implemented on 200 millimeter fabs. Do you think that there's going to be more? It doesn't sound like there are many people creating new 200 millimeter fabs because that's probably uneconomical. Will these fabs be up for sale? Is there going to be turnover in the ownership of these 200 millimeter fabs?
I appreciate the question, Ira. It's a good one. The supply chain with respect to 200 millimeter tools, no longer exists. You pretty much are going to pay a premium for 200 millimeter tools today. Those 200 millimeter fabs are not going away. In fact, what's happening is a lot of companies are starting to use 300 millimeter tools to meet their 200 millimeter production needs. We've seen Texas Instruments do this very successfully with respect to their analog products. And we're seeing, IDMs like Infineon, Rome, ST Micro as well are transitioning even some of their third generation products for GaN, silicon carbide, into 200 millimeter fabs. So the demand is still really there. And as I stated earlier, the cost to build these are expensive, in the 2.5 billion plus range for a 200 millimeter fab. And that's a 3-year process. So they're in short supply, they're in real demand. And what we're seeing is an increase in prices for 200 millimeter facilities right now, particularly if they come with a supply agreement. So watch the space, as we move forward. I guess the final thing just to maybe mention at the bottom there is, looking at global M&A activity, we've moved to a point where we're seeing, deals done in the 100 billion plus range in 3 out of the last 6 years, which is just, unprecedented. And at the same time, we're seeing much more scrutiny of those deals, which I think is important to mention to people. NVIDIA's $40 billion bid for ARM raised anti-competitive concerns for UK regulators. This past year, Wise Road Capital's acquisition of Magnachip Technology has also just been challenged. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson as well just asked for a security review of the Nexperia acquisition of Britain's biggest 8-inch fab, the Newport wafer fab down in Wales. So watch that space too. Changes are happening in all of these areas. If we move to slide 9, it really gives a little bit more of a update of the sale of back end and front end facilities over the last 10 years. You can see there's been 33 back end sales and 71 front end sales. You'll also note that they've been declining really since 2017. And while 2021 is off to a good start, I'm not sure we'll exactly get back to some of the levels that we were at previously. Some of that is really due to the consolidation that has continued to happen within the industry, driving up those M&A values. In terms of some of the deals that have done this year on the front end side, one of them has been the sale of the Kasana or Silterra fab over in Malaysia that went to DNEX and the CGP fund out of China, who took a 40% interest. There was also the Mitsumi Omeron deal in Yasu, Japan, another 200 millimeter fab. And then the TI Micron Lehigh, Utah facility that I mentioned, the Nexperia purchased down in Newport, Wales. And then just recently in August, Foxconn purchased a facility from Macronix in Taiwan, a 150 millimeter facility that they paid $90.8 million just for a shell. It wasn't even a working fab, but to give an indication of what's happening with respect to pricing. If we go to slide 10, we can look a little bit more into what's happening, with respect to back end and the precarious dependency on, Asian manufacturing. So you've got in the left-hand corner the fabs that have sold, and and a breakdown of those by facility type, and then it's showing kind of where the transactions have happened. And as you can see, the rest of Asia Pac has had the greatest number of sales. And just to hit on a few back end facilities, as I mentioned, the Allegro sale of their facility in North Bangkok, Thailand, Innolite. In April, we also had Vanguard, who purchased a facility from AUO in Hsinchu in Taiwan. And at the beginning of the year, Skywater here in the US ended up purchasing a back-end facility down in Osceola County in Florida. And I think the other thing to mention is just, for the Taiwanese OSATs, they've got really tight capacity supply right now for packaging services. Chip probing, final test operations are going to remain tight through 2022, largely because of the significant demand from IC designers and also for automotive chips and for IDMs. The big product drivers, today are CMOS image sensors, automotive MCUs, wireless communications, silicon carbide, GaN, power chips, RF modules, etc. With that, let's move on to slide 11. And this really touches on what's happening with respect to Greenfield facilities around the world. You see this is on the front end side, but projected high volume fabs that will be starting construction. In the orange are what's taking place. And just to give you a little breakdown of that, in China, there's going to be 8 fabs. SMIC just recently announced a $8.87 billion 12-inch Shanghai fab. They're expecting 100,000 wafers at a 28 nanometer node. Taiwan, there are 8 expected there. In the Americas, you've got 6. Europe, Middle East, 3. Korea, 2. Japan, 2. And with respect to 19 high volume fabs by the end of 2021, 15 of those 19 are going to be 300 millimeter fabs. And I think it's fair to say that those numbers are likely to climb with more announcements coming over time. Let's move to talk a little bit.
So, Stephen, just a quick question on the last slide, related to the last slide. So one of the audience attendees asked, so when you build a fab, what attributes does a company look for and when they pick a site? And is there a different criteria, let's say, when you're looking for a site in the EU or the US versus Asia?
No, I appreciate it. Very good question. I think the model is changing. It used to be a comparison between kind of the eastern band of China from a cost standpoint to what was happening in the US, what was happening in Europe, and in all honesty, from a labor standpoint, those costs have equaled out over time. There's also been a significant move really pushed by Wall Street for companies to downsize and get rid of that depreciation on their balance sheet, drive up their gross margin, and basically move towards fab light. It is still happening. Wall Street is still having a big effect, but I think companies that are fabless out there and or that have moved to fab light are starting to find their things are pinching with regard to production, and now they're looking to say, okay, where should that be? You can even make the case a little bit as we're watching some companies like Micron who are putting their facilities next to their assembly and test facilities and wanting large sites where they have all of that in one geographic location for expediency. There's no doubt the last 10 years, the majority of that growth has been in China, has been in Taiwan, has been in Korea. But I think with the incentive packages that we're going to profile here in a minute, we will see a change in that. And already with the TSMC's announced fab going into Arizona, and it's no secret that Samsung are looking for something else in the United States to expand. Micron, have also been looking to expand within the U.S. So I think we're going to see it happen in a number of different regions, and kind of like what happened with Bosch, they determined to keep their, to do a brand new development in Dresden, even though it meant, all their production facilities were in Germany and they weren't really spreading the risk. Nonetheless, they felt the majority of their clients are automotive. It's close to them, and they can service it with their world-class engineers. So a lot of decisions go into it. Money is certainly a big component to that. And as we talk further about the incentive packages, we can touch on that a little bit more. Let's move to slide 12 and then, in fact, slide 13, if we can. With respect to the global OSAT market overview, the OSAT market has been incredibly competitive. As we all know, it consists of several major players with ASE, Amkor, JSET, who dominate the market. And it's a market which is expected to grow at 7.3%, compound annual growth rate. I think it's important to note that a significant portion of the technology patents that are coming from U.S. companies is now, making that market in the U.S. a little bit more significant. We're seeing, some more investments taking place. We're seeing with the technological advancement and innovation of new applications that these are driving the U.S. OSAT market growth. And although China, dominates the global OSAT market, and the U.S. is retaining a strong position today. And not to leave out Europe, there are around 100 packaging, assembly and test companies and facilities within Europe, mainly small and mid-sized, often very specialized, and with fixed customer base, and a focus on high mix, low volume, special solutions. I think where the gap is with beyond flip chip, namely, wafer level packaging, fan in, fan out. These aren't available in independent OSAT packaging, assembly and test, providers to the extent I think clients would like to see it. But captive mainly in, foundries and IDMs, and system manufacturers and institutes only. Shifting back to China just a little bit, there is a growing adoption also of advanced packaging, and OSAT vendors, in terms of innovation and supply chain positions, are going to be crucial to their ongoing, system level performance increases there. Some deals that have happened this year: UTAC, purchased a Singapore wafer bumping assets from PowerTech, and then a year ago in October, ASE, MOE, and MCUST jointly established an on-site campus assembly and test facility. To keep moving here, if you look at the revenue of the top 20 publicly traded OSATs, this is, I'm sure, familiar to a lot of you. That revenue grew by 4.2 billion year over year in 2020, and it will increase this year, as we stated, by about another 17.5%. I think what's interesting is if you look down that list, there's only one U.S. company in the top 20 companies. They're primarily Taiwanese and Chinese companies that are dominating this industry today, and the industry is continuing to increase. If we take a look at slide 15, in terms of just seeing how steady that increase has been, over the last years, to get to that price point, I think it tells you where the industry is going as a whole. But now take a look at this at our slide 16 here, in terms of what's happening if we go back to where are the fab assets. This chart gives us a good idea, and as you'll note, almost 60% of the OSAT facilities are in China and Taiwan. So let's focus there for just a minute. Within Taiwan, the back-end houses have enjoyed, an incredibly strong influx of orders from automotive, 5G handsets, and others. SiP packaging has been important. AIP, wire bonding services, gross margins have been strong. They've had record level revenue and profit, and it is likely to persist well through 2022. And there's a new semi-hotspot outside of Taiwan too that we should reference, which has been Vietnam. It's been up and coming in terms of manufacturing, and the market is really poised to grow by 6.1 billion between 2020 and 2024. Let's moving from there to China and looking at the Made in China 2025 initiatives. This is the biggest OSAT market in the world. Its supply chain is on track, for self-sufficiency. The OSATs are developing, 2.5D, their fan out, and other advanced packaging technologies, really to serve the domestic market and to serve international chip makers. And that's going to become more difficult in the current geopolitical environment. I think an interesting element to all this as well is the supply chain that exists, and China has built a phenomenal one, particularly in terms of dedicated talent. McKinsey has named this as one of the big areas that we're going to see a shortage for semiconductor companies in terms of manufacturing, given the lower rates of engineers coming out of grad schools. And Morris Chang spoke out about it recently and said that when talking about the efforts by China and the U.S. to build their own chip making capacities, he said, however, they lack dedicated talent, including dedicated and committed engineers, technicians, production line workers, as well as the capability to mobilize manufacturing personnel on a large scale. He also said unit cost of chip making in the U.S. is higher than Taiwan. It adds subsidies from the federal and state governments, and they're not going to last forever. So taking a shot over the bow at the incentive packages coming out in the current CHIPS Act. So we'll see where this is going to take us. Our next slide 17, talks about how advanced packaging is really coming into its own. I think it's fair to say that things like the Chips for America Act are helping that, and the previous CHIPS Act, which Intel, Qorvo, and other companies benefited from in the U.S. for advanced packaging, has been important. We're also seeing significant investments happening in Europe. They're trying to strengthen their local supply chain, and they're devoting time to back-end initiatives. Things like the IPK2, is targeting that. These are important projects for microelectronics. And their goal is to close the gap in advanced packaging and see more of that in Europe, where they've got a second source and a secure, supply chain. It's also been the creation of the ECIPAT group. It's a European chapter that was founded in 2016 and has got a big group associated with it. And within this chart too, you see the growth between 2015 and 2025 of with respect to advanced nodes and what is needed in terms of what's happening on that timeline with respect to advanced packaging. Let's turn and take a quick look here at global incentives. With regard to that, if you go to slide 19, you'll note, what's been happening. And it's almost like we got a war on between countries, each one trying to outdo each other. South Korea has really come up with probably the biggest package due over the next 10 years. 455 billion is promised within that. And then if you turn to the European Union, they've had their Horizon, it started as 2020 or Horizon Europe, where they've got up to 15 billion for digital and emerging technologies. But importantly, their IPK package of 50 billion is also extremely important. We're finishing a deal in Belgium right now on behalf of ON, and the buyer is taking advantage of those IPK incentives to transform a 6-inch facility that they had 70% of the tools had conversion kits to a 200 millimeter facility. Then you look at China, which has just been a slow and steady march, putting 20 to 25 billion a year into a semiconductor to really make that a independent and autonomous industry within China. They've grown it spectacularly, and it will continue to grow with another 150 billion due to come in over the next 9 years through 2030. And finally, the United States, which is getting closer to passing their infrastructure bill, which will be linked into the CHIPS Act, or the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. The Senate has passed this, and it is very likely to be passing the House as well. So all around, it's a real interesting time for the chip industry, and I think we're going to see some very significant changes happen with new fabs coming on board in places that we haven't seen in the last decade, particularly in Europe, particularly within the United States. If we continue on to our next slide here, this just gives a little comparison of what these different countries are providing in terms of those incentives. Interestingly, land, is provided almost free within China and within Germany too. Israel, Singapore, South Korea, more expensive, obviously, in the US at only 50% subsidization, and in Taiwan. Then construction of facilities, again, China leading, providing up to 65% of the cost of construction, the US being a smaller amount there, and equipment too. But I'll say that those things are changing. The state of New York, with respect to CRE, funded not only close to half their tool set, but funded the construction of that building in New York State. And I think they'll be prepared to do so again here in the future. Importantly, too, tax deductions are significant. The corporate tax rate, China, take a look at, what they're doing there in terms of that subsidization. That said, also look at what the U.S. is doing with 100%, tax forgiveness on the state side and on the property tax side, if you're bringing new jobs and creating new employment for organizations. Moving and looking.
But before you go on, is this going to be sufficient really to bring manufacturing back in the U.S.? Is it enough, especially when you look at the numbers?
I think, proof's in the pudding a little bit. The CRE deal, has been seen as an outstanding deal, inked, a year and a half ago, and a real positive, and showed what New York State was able to do. I think the deal in Arizona with TSMC is another, really great sign for, what can happen here in the U.S. And I think, Ira, we're going to see in the next 2 quarters actually how this translates with regard to the CHIPS Act and where those monies flow to bring manufacturing back here. I think the protectionism, if you want to call it that, desire for control, risk mitigation, within boardrooms, there are some significant incentives that are going to be put out over this next year, and it'll be a real telltale sign. In Europe, the Dresden facility and the Avezzano expansion for ST is a good sign. Apple has chosen to go into Munich, with a big design center. There's an expansion happening in Austria and Graz with, AMS. So it's not at the scale China is, but China is also 4 times the size of the United States. And so one would expect that, they would be, and they've had a continued push on that over these last years. So I don't know, let's look at this next slide. It talks a little bit more about the states. So slide 21 here shows, where states are positioning themselves, for this. I think it's fair to say it's a fairly small grouping in the United States where the semiconductor clusters are, where you've got strong supply chains. Oregon, on the Oregon-Washington border, you've got a lot of fabs. Obviously, Arizona has become a real, important place with Intel being so strongly headquartered there. They're in Oregon as well. But Texas, has consistently, been a big proponent with respect to semiconductor. And then, there's more happening over on the East Coast from Florida up through, Virginia, and most importantly, the big supply chain and ecosystem that's been building in New York State with global foundries there, with ON having gone in to take a 300 millimeter facility, and now Cree coming in, and with, the biggest research universities and number of engineers that are being turned out are actually being turned out up in the state of New York. Cornell and RTP and RISV. So if we're to believe what McKinsey says about needing, those engineers, that might be another attraction for companies, in the future in terms of where they go.
Related to this, there was a question from the audience about likelihood of Intel or Samsung building in upstate New York. Where would you put that on the scale of probability?
I think if you talk to some of the site selectors, and you look at like the top 8 to 10 sites in the United States, I want to say 3 of them are in New York. So I would say there's probably a very good possibility that, yes, they are looking at New York. I think the fact too that Senator Schumer is the leading senator in the Senate, and he's a retail politician, and he gets around and sees all of his people. He's probably going to have some influence on that decision in terms of where, monies fall. The big debate is how, will those monies be divided? I don't think any one state is going to be able to, claim a majority of that. They want it to be spread evenly, over states. And is that, $5 billion, per project, $10 billion per project? I'm sure they'll judge it on the merits of it, but I think New York stands in really good stead. Look at that, where Cree went in Utica, the MV Edge site, have been ahead of the game for a number of years, and New York, through 7 administrations, Democrat and Republican, have strongly supported the semi industry. So I'm sure they're looking. I guess we'll know, really probably over this next 6 months based on those funds flowing.
Thank you.
So, if we move over to Europe very quickly on slide 22, prominent, government incentives coming out of Europe right now for research, for innovation. They want to get back towards the top. There's a big debate happening there with Thierry Breton, who is the minister for the microelectronics industry, kind of pushing for leading edge. I think a lot of others are saying, I'm not sure we need to be doing 5 and 3 nanometer. There's so much meat and potatoes, power products and others that are needed within the European Union. Big site just recently arose outside of Belgium, and there Dresden has certainly made a big play to see more fab development. So we'll see what will happen there. But both the Horizon Europe and IPK 2 initiatives are going to drive certainly more fab manufacturing, and it may be on the advanced packaging side of the equation. So to kind of, as we draw to a close here, let's just look at our key takeaways and maybe skip down to slide 2024 if we can. The government incentives over this next 5 years are likely to be a game changer and impact the economics of significant regions. This lays out some stuff related to advanced logic, advanced memory, advanced analog, what's happening in each one of those. And I've touched, a few of these projects that are out there happening right now, from Cree, Wolfspeed through to Samsung, who talked about a $17 billion expansion. Right now, talk is Texas. But, they've also made claims there that are pretty substantial. They've got probably the second or third biggest foundry, in the world as well. It's a little less known than what they do on the IDM side. And then looking at TSMC's announcement of $20 billion going into their fab in Arizona. So government incentives are going to be a game changer. I think that's takeaway number one for us. Takeaway number two is that greenfields are back in and they're being built. Here's a picture of the Cree facility in Marcy and near Utica, New York, and another picture of the Bosch Dresden facility that they just cut the tape on 60 days ago. And those facilities are important within their respective regions. We anticipate that this trend, will accelerate with more government incentives becoming available around the globe. And we'll see more shiny fabs probably mushrooming up over this next 5-year period in the short term. In terms of a takeaway number three, I think there's going to be a new creative fab collaboration models that will start emerging. We've just seen the announcement with respect to ST on their 300 millimeter fab in Agrate in Italy, where they're planning to share that with Tower, a significant foundry manufacturer. We're looking at, fab refurbishment and the Micron Intel that, managed down in the Utah Lehigh facility. And that fab's now going to become an analog facility. It's moving from memory, to analog. But these types of collaborations, I think we'll see more of. And I anticipate we'll see a couple of mid-tier companies that perhaps partner to take over 300 millimeter fabs and share the operational expense, mitigate for, being put on allocation, which they don't have a lot of control over when they are competing against the big boys. I think we'll see some more of that taking place, as we look ahead this next 5 years. And a final takeaway number 4 is that the growth of the global OSAT, manufacturing, it will really continue. The market is projected to be worth over $56 billion by 2026. We're seeing, U.S. projects are emerging, European projects are emerging. IP is becoming, really critical. There's a desire to kind of, ensure that last mile, if you will, of with respect to companies' product. It's becoming really important. And OSAT really remains an essential pillar, for widening the technology gap between front end and back end scaling. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as we go forward. So the industry is exciting, a lot to see and watch for. I'll stop there and answer any other questions that might be there for the audience.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Excuse me. So you touched upon the need for human capital, but, how many more, any idea if how many additional semiconductor experts would the U.S. have to be either creating or graduating or how or training to reach our full potential for the fabs we have or the fabs we want to have? I mean, how big is the gap domestically, if you have a feeling for that?
The feeling that I have is, I think the number that I heard was that I want to say it's around 7,000 engineers going into the engineering profession that could migrate towards semiconductor. Whether they're finishing up and going into the industry, I don't know what that number is. But on an annual basis, in terms of those that are, going into engineering in the U.S., that is, one number that I'm familiar with. But the McKinsey study, which I think people can go online and take a look at that, has really highlighted a shortage within that area. And I think it's fair to say, too, that we all know these fabs develop a certain culture, within them to maintain those high yields and, for a workforce to work cohesively. And, over the years, we've seen, for example, a lot of companies shy away from places like California because they felt the big companies would simply poach their workforce and it'd be continually depleting and they'd be taking them away. And we haven't seen a lot of growth in fabs, in California, some of it due to regulation, others due to they just haven't really prioritized fabs. But a big piece of it has also been stuff on the workforce side. I think some of these companies that are, acquiring fabs, part of the equation for them is they're getting, ready-made workforces that they can start with immediately. And it's been why some of the brownfields or existing facilities have done well, and why we've been seeing some strong interest in existing facilities when they've become available. And as you noted from that bar graph I showed, it's not a lot. In a typical year, if we have 3, even 5 sales, that's a big year for semi. So not a lot that come available for sale in a given year.
Right. And so it's almost not to the extreme in the software industry where they have acqui-hires, where people are just buying the company for the workforce. It's the combination of the facility and the workforce that makes it attractive.
It's the tool sets are now precious commodities because we've got, a supply shortage on the 200 millimeter side, in terms of leading edge, they've needed to create, to put those new tools down, they've needed to get rid of some of the mature or lagging edge tools. The market's adapted those, for use on the 200 millimeter side. But the tool shortage has been a big issue, and it has definitely affected the industry. And I think just product life cycles are shorter. So, having a fab that's up and running, tools are installed, you've got a workforce there. People are getting really good at, changing and modifying some of those processes. And I think it's why used secondhand fabs, we've seen the price rises for them. And I think we'll continue to see more demand for those.
Right. Building on one of the questions from the audience, the U.S. government seems to support R&D and not actually manufacturing as much, and the manufacturing incentives are coming from the states. And so this pits the states against each other. Do you see any change in that trend, or is it a healthy direction, or should the government put more money into manufacturing, not just R&D?
My sense is related to this CHIPS Act that that money is going to go into manufacturing. That is going to be to put up bricks and mortar manufacturing facilities that hopefully are going to be there for the next 30, 50 years or longer. Whether that will be sustained over the longer term, like China, what China has done, I think remains to be seen. It might be a short burst, and we see the benefit of it with 10 fabs built over this next 5 years. IRA. Yes, throughout the last 100 years, there has been definitely a greater propensity to fund R&D and research, and I think that will continue. But even there, we've dipped pretty significantly from where we were 30, 40 years ago, and I think America has realized there's got to be a greater commitment to that to keep our technology edge and an advantage here. So yeah, to be determined.
Okay. So here's a specific question on I think you had a number where you have 19 OSATs in the EU. And the question was, are you counting the IDM back-end sites, or these are true OSATs that make services available to the industry in general? I don't remember which slide it is, but it's a specific question.
I'm just going back to it really quickly here. Yes, Europe. There it is. Sorry, 19 OSAT facilities within the region, and those those are dedicated OSAT facilities that are producing within Europe right now. Now, it's not taken into consideration a lot of the research and other facilities that I referenced. There's about 100 much smaller ones that are operating within the European Union, but I do think it's a sign of the importance of this for the European Union, and they are fighting for their industry, their microelectronics industries, increasing relevance, and I think it's something that got pushed a little bit to the side, maybe given all the other things that they've been dealing with over the last number of years, but it's moved to the top of their agenda, like it has for the United States, and I think we'll see a concerted effort with this Horizon funding and this IPK funding happening in Europe right now. We're active on 3 projects there, and we're seeing it firsthand in terms of the grants and how quickly they're being expedited and moved through. I mean, this isn't stuff that's taken a year. This is stuff that's being dealt with in 2 months, 3 months, moving forward. So I think Europe will continue to be relevant, and I think on the OSAT side, we'll see growth continuing to happen there.
Okay. Thank you. Well, one last question, since we're running out of time, but in the transactions that you're involved in, or in the planning of new fabs and locations, do you see more attention to climate change mitigation, being greener? Is this really a discussion as part of some of the decisions people are making, or is there going to have to be some large changes ahead to address those issues?
I'd say the sentiment is there, and you'll see every company in terms of their advertising talking about how they're definitely being greener, but I think the dependence on fossil fuels and others is still really strong, and that there has not been enough of a look on the manufacturing side as to what they could be doing to be greener, and there needs to be more of a push, I think, within that area, and perhaps with infrastructure bills coming through, people looking at the grid, and looking what goes into these, to power and run these facilities. Hopefully, some steps could be made with some of the new facilities that do get built, that they could be greener and more, environmentally conscious, more energy efficient. But I would say we're lacking. The industry's lacking in that area as we deal with a lot of these facilities.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you for an excellent presentation. My apologies to all the questions that we didn't get a chance to get to, but Stephen's contact information is there, and we look forward to having you at a future webinar again. So, but thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you, Ira. I really appreciate it.
In terms of future webinars, we are working on the schedule. Our goal is to have 2 a month, and they will start at the same time, approximately start at 11:30 a.m. Pacific, run approximately an hour. If you are interested in speaking or would like to suggest a topic for a future webinar, please reach out to me, ira@meptec.org. Happy to take your suggestions and referrals. There's a wide range of topics related to microelectronics, packaging, test, and design that we are interested in. So happy to have suggestions. In terms of dates, please save the date for the next Road to Chiplets webinar on data and test, November 9th and 10th. We will shortly be announcing the program. You can find it on events.meptec.org. And with that, I would like to wish everybody a good rest of your day and look forward to having you at a future webinar. Thank you.